Welcome back to Curious Now from the Center for Medical Simulation. I'm Jenny Rudolph. Have you ever struggled with this situation like I do? You can see something that someone else really should do differently, or you have a better idea about how they should do it, but you really don't want to insult them. You don't want to condescend to them. You want to maintain your relationship with them. And you really struggle to figure out how to say directly the insight that you have. So this dilemma has been haunting me probably for almost 20 years now. And it's this problem that launched me in writing an article 19 years ago called There's No Such Thing as a Non-Judgmental Debriefing with Good Judgment. And what I want to talk about with you today and over the next few sessions together in our kind of chapter is going to be, how does the with good judgment approach play out in the kind of contexts we've been talking about every day? When you feel a judgment bubbling up, when you feel the freight train of emotions behind that judgment, when you recognize that somebody had one set of expectations and you had another, and your psychological contract with them got breached and you're pissed. How do we talk about that with each other? How do we manage our feelings, our reactions, and how do we express our positive regard for other people while also having a critique, perhaps, of what's going on for them? So, to cut through all this, our readiness goal this week is to be ready to note when you are tempted to use a hidden judgment approach. What are your motivations? What's going on with you? So, get ready to note when you want to use the hidden judgment approach. So, the with good judgment approach came about because I noticed that me and my colleagues tended to use a lot of guess what I'm thinking questions when we were in feedback conversations or in debriefings with each other. And I got so uncomfortable with that because me and my team, especially my mentor, Jeff Cooper, espoused this value of being open and honest about mistakes and errors in healthcare. And I thought, wow, it would be great if we could be open and honest about mistakes and errors in simulations as well. But I didn't want to hurt people's feelings, and I couldn't figure out how to both share my insight that maybe they'd messed up something and that I still thought well of them and I wanted to maintain my relationship with them. So, in this chapter, we're going to be talking about how do you interact with people in ways that come naturally and or in ways that have to be trained. And what we found is in everyday interactions, people tend to do one of three things often. They hide their judgment when they're in a feedback conversation or trying to help influence somebody else's behavior. And they use a kind, friendly tone of voice usually, and they might ask leading questions or open-ended questions. But the goal is to hide the critical insight that they hold because they're worried that that's going to torpedo the relationship. We're also going to talk about another very common approach in everyday conversations, which is when somebody's done something, I have a judgment about it. The freight train of emotions bears down on me. I have a high standard that they have not met. And I am going to talk to them in a way that's really harsh and potentially even angry, an approach that we call harsh judgment. And hiding your judgment and having a harsh judgment be expressed, both super normal, happen to all of us.
Yeah, I'm really noticing just like the pattern of both harshness and hiddenness being very natural expressions of human anxiety or stress
Mm-hmm.
in different responses. Reaching your hand out to grab someone if you're pulling into a red light too fast, is almost like the harsh judgment version. And then the other version is bracing yourself in your chair where you're like, oh God, like slow down, slow down, slow down. Like your foot's like reaching out for the brake pedal, even though you're in the passenger seat.
Right, right, right. One's more obvious and interactive, and one's more hidden. Yeah, I see that. And I concur with the insight about anxiety, James. I hadn't thought about that before because when I lose my SHIT, it's usually because I'm anxious, very anxious about something. And when I hide my judgment, it's because I'm anxious about harming the relationship, usually, or I feel that if I'm too direct, that will insult the other person or reduce their options, and that won't feel good to them or might feel condescending.
Yeah,
So,
and I feel like the ambient stress level of the environment raises your internal stress level. And so in a high anxiety or high stress environment like healthcare, it just seems so obvious that these might be even easier to reach to at if they are both sort of responses to ambient and internal stress
mm-hmm.
versus the sort of Daniel Kahneman system to like noticing my thinking, thinking about my thinking, and getting to let me hold both of these things in in union, the standard and my feelings about you.
Yeah. Well, and I think another way to say what you've said is when we're under stress, threat rigidity theory tells us we regress to well learned responses. And I think that means regress to thinking fast, which in this case usually means regress to harsh judgment, regress to hidden judgment, and that good judgment for most of us, most of the time, is a more deliberate, thinking slow approach and requires more prefrontal cortex bandwidth, uh, making it hard to do when you're stressed. Yeah, I think that's a great insight, James. I really like that. And then the third approach that many of us can learn is with good judgment, which is I'm going to have my high standards about what you should do. I'm going to care about my relationship with you, and I'm going to pack those two in together in my thinking and my feelings such that I'm going to share my point of view with you, but I'm going to assume the best of you. So I remember a time when I was driving home from school with my older daughter, Gia, and she hadn't done her homework the day before as I had thought she had, and she had another big assignment coming up, and we were driving down the road, and I was basically reprimanding her and saying, listen, if you don't get this done today, it's going to all pile up and your test is going to be on such and such a day. And, of course, my anxiety was driving what I was saying. We got almost all the way home, and Gia, who, of course, has heard me talking about with good judgment for years, it's like, hey, Mom, you don't even know my frame. You haven't been curious about what I'm thinking. You don't know anything about why or I did or did not do my homework as stipulated by you. So the dilemma here is once we get hooked into something, it's really easy for us to express harsh judgment. When we're anxious about the relationship, it's very easy for us to hide our judgment and use beating around the bush and indirect modes of communication. And all of this leads away from what author Kim Scott, in her book, How to Be a Kick Ass Boss Without Losing Your Soul, calls radical candor. The challenge is how do we get to a place internally where I can both recognize that there might be a standard, like getting your homework done at a specific time, that I care about, and positive regard for my daughter in this case, that there might be some good reasons she did what she did or didn't do what she didn't do, and that I need to be curious about all that. And so in this chapter together, we're going to be exploring what propels and what are our options with respect to hidden judgment, harsh judgment, and good judgment. Part of this gets especially tricky depending on the level of power we have in a certain situation. So if I'm a new employee and I have an observation in a meeting about something that's going on, I may understandably want to use a hidden judgment approach and ask somewhat obfuscating, open ended questions such that I'm not putting my new boss on the back foot. We'll explore a little bit about how positive that can be, how negative that can be, what are the impacts of those sorts of things, and how straightforward can you be depending on your level of power. So, I want to talk a little bit about how the insights around the with good judgment approach emerged. So, one big part of it was that I, as a doctoral student, was doing research with my then mentor, John Carroll, a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. And we were looking at how do nuclear power plants learn from accident and error. And what I noticed when we were analyzing these after action reviews of the accidents and errors was that there were these really understandable dilemmas that the managers having to manage the post error or post accident moment struggled with. So, one of the understandable dilemmas was like, this was really bad and it needs to be fixed immediately. And they were anxious about each other's safety. They were anxious about the regulatory agencies that oversaw their plant. And those managers, the tone of voice, if you can, in the reports that they wrote, was quite harsh and almost like a school teacher reprimanding their colleagues on what they had done and exhorting them to do better in the future. And that approach started percolating in my mind as sort of a judgmental approach, a harsh approach, and it sort of stuck there. But the other thing that John Carroll and I gradually found was that many power plants had learned that that harsh judgment approach didn't really help people do better in the future, and that, in fact, it often backfired and led to people hiding future errors. So we found that there was another cadre of plants that started using a kinder, gentler, more open approach to these accident and errors and asking people to tell them about what happened, not having any punishments, not using a hectoring, lecturing tone of voice in the after action reviews, not having the kind of remedial human resource response that kind of made people feel like they were like bad doggy. They realized that really didn't work. And so they had a much more open and kind, really only discovery mode approach to those accidents and errors. So while that was a reasonable direction to learn from the bad, harsh judgment approach to the nuclear power after action reviews, the understandable dilemma of not wanting to shame people, not wanting to demoralize people, led to this sort of hidden judgment, softer approach. But that also did not work well because they didn't hold the standard for safety that was really, really important. And it wasn't until we got to a third set of plants that we were studying. And in fact, we shifted industries and started looking at petrochemical processing plants, that we discovered that there were some plants that were able to do what we called deep learning, and which I would later sort of see as a with good judgment approach. And that involved holding really high standards for safety by exploring in detail how did these accidents come about, but also always assuming the best of the employees. So, for example, a typical kind of thing that might happen in a petrochemical plant is some people are really responsible for making sure the plant processes as much oil as possible to turn it into gas. So it's about production. Other people have a metric on which their work is measured, which is how much money do they spend on cleaning different parts of the plant. and a third group might have a metric around safety. And if those groups don't talk, it turns out that those metrics can clash in unexpected ways. And in one study that we reviewed, cause a fairly major explosion and accident. But the team that investigated that figured out that everybody had a reasonable rationale for what they were doing, each team, and were trying to work toward a certain standard or incentive that had been made clear to them, and that it was intersection of these standards and incentives that led to the accident. And their kindly, fair, but rigorous approach, which was like, this is not okay, here's the standard of safety, but we understand why you did it, allowed them to analyze it in depth in a way that felt fair to people and led to genuine insights that transformed the practice at the plant. So, what we're going to be exploring in the next few episodes together is, how do you get stuck in hidden judgment, get stuck in harsh judgment, and move yourself over to leading with good judgment, feedback conversations with good judgment, debriefing with good judgment, where you balance a high standard that you want to help yourself or others move toward with high regard for them, such that, like that final chemical processing plant, we can understand fairly and empathetically together what's going on and move to a better level of practice. So, our workout of the week this week is just to start noting a pattern of when you are tempted to hide your judgment. And that happens to us all the time. I want to give somebody a little bit of a critical piece of information, but not really. I'm going to hide it. And the second part of the workout is, what are your motivations there? So for me, for example, I often think I know the best way to do something. I really want to tell someone else my opinion on what is the best way to load the dishwasher, but I also don't want to piss her off. So in that case, I might find myself just asking, did it occur to you to line all the plates up together? Which can land as so darn condescending and totally backfires, of course, also. But in the moment, the dilemma between being straightforward and maintaining the relationship can make me get my feet and my voice all tangled up. And I use these kind of hidden judgment type questions. So I invite you to figure out for yourself, when are you tempted to hide your judgment and what are your motivations?